Good morning and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristin. Today we're opening the gate and slipping into Granary Burying Ground, a hollowed acre of stone and silence buried deep within the pulse of Boston. Here beneath crooked willows and soot-darkened skies lie the bones of revolutionaries and rogues. Marble cherubs weep over sunken graves, while time-worn epitaphs whisper the names of patriots, poets, and those long forgotten by the living. In this city of the dead, history lingers like smoke, and every cracked headstone hums with unfinished songs. The aroma of coffee mingles in the air, the gates stand open. Step carefully. It's time to descend into the hauntings of history. I would dare say that Granary Burying Ground is not just one of Boston's most historic cemeteries. It's a reliquary of the American Revolution itself, a place where the marrow of history sleeps beneath worn slate and creeping moss. As part of the Freedom Trail, countless visitors pass through its iron gates each year, tracing the names that they learned in textbooks: Hancock, Revere, Adams, Paine. Names that ring like Liberty bells in the minds of patriots and schoolchildren alike. But what of those whose echoes are fainter? Crispus Attucks, who died in the first surge of resistance; James Otis Jr., whose thunderous voice kindled rebellion, only to die struck by lightning; Samuel Sewall, who once condemned witches, only later to confess his guilt. These are names most forget or never learned, and yet they too helped shape the world we inherited. Every stone bears witness, every grave holds a thread in the tangled cloth of our nation's past. Some names endure in marble, others linger only in memory, but all mattered. Stepping beneath the stone archway within the grounds, you cross a threshold into a quieter world, one where time curls inward and peace hums just beneath the surface. Here there's a stillness that feels sacred, heavy, final, yet alive with memory. Granary Burying Ground is deceptively deep, stretching far beyond what the narrow gate suggests. Though it lies in the heart of a restless city, hemmed by stone and sirens, its soil cradles more than 2,800 marked graves, and it's thought perhaps as many as 5,000 souls are within. The burying ground became the city's third resting place, consecrated in 1660 when the dead outgrew Boston's earliest burying grounds. King's Chapel, just a block away, can no longer shoulder the burden of morality. At first, the new ground was called the South Burying Ground, but in time it took the name of the granary that once stood tall beside it, where now the Park Street Church cast its shadow. In 1830s, some tried to rewrite the story, planting trees and attempting to rename it Franklin Cemetery in honor of Benjamin Franklin's family. But names like spirits are not easily displaced. The old title held fast, and the gravestones wouldn't answer to any other name. The land itself was once part of the Boston Common, back when the commons stretched like an open lung across the city. But slowly, as the living pressed inward, the dead were hemmed in. A house of correction rose nearby, the granary, and residences. The graveyard, once a part of something vast, became a square of silence, walled in by progress. Yet here beneath the European elms that still bow like mourners, history endures. Names carved in stone, lives severed by time, and the stories some celebrated, others nearly smothered in soil, await for those who care enough to listen. I think beginning with the story of Crispus Attucks feels right. He stands quite literally at the threshold of the American Revolution. Little is known of his early life, and perhaps that's fitting. The forgotten often become symbols like he did, shadows stretching far beyond the span of a single lifetime. Of African and Wampanoag descent, Crispus Attucks was likely born around 1723. Enslaved in Massachusetts and later by courage, cunning, or sheer providence, a free man. He was a sailor, a rope maker, and a wanderer whose footsteps traced coastlines more often than city streets. The life of Crispus Attucks is largely obscured, veiled by time and the smoke of revolution. What little we know has been pulled from fragments and aliases. In the earliest reports of the Boston Massacre, he's referred to not as Attucks, but as Michael Johnson, perhaps a name out of necessity or one chosen to slip between borders unnoticed. Only later, when his true name was uncovered, did the papers reveal scattered details that he was born in Framingham, Massachusetts, that he had sailed from New Providence in the Bahamas, and that his ship had been bound for North Carolina. His surname Addix comes from the native language meaning deer, a name that echoes movement, elusiveness, and the hunted. His story, like so many of the forgotten, emerges only in the moment he fell. On the evening of March the 5th, 1770, as tensions between colonialists and British troops boiled over, Addix found himself near the custom house, where red-coated soldiers and angry citizens collided in the flicker of lantern light. Words were shouted, ice and oyster shells thrown, followed by gunfire. Addix was the first to fall, shot twice in the chest. His blood spilled into the snow, staining it red, foretelling a war not yet begun. He died not as a soldier, but as a symbol, not as a general, but as a ghost, the first martyr of the American Revolution, though many would try to erase or soften his legacy in the decades that followed. During the trials that followed his death, witnesses struggled to define him. Some called him mulatto, others Indian. Their uncertainty speaks volumes, for Addix wasn't easily contained, not by race, not by record, not by empire. Was he a hero or rabble-rouser, a patriot or a threat? To the Grimm, the answer is simple: he was human, and he died because the storm of revolution needed a spark. Today, Crispus Attucks rests in Granary Burying Ground, beneath the elms and iron. His name is carved in stone beside the other victims of the Boston Massacre, though his legacy rises far above it. He was the first to fall, and in that fall, a nation began to rise. But before the tensions could reach the doorstep of the customs house, where did it begin? It began with orators like James Otis Jr., fittingly also a resident of Granary. Gifted with a voice that echoed louder than any cannon, sharp, righteous, and unrelenting, James Otis Jr. was a man whose words lit the fuse of revolution long before the first shot was fired. Born in 1725 in Barnstable, Massachusetts, Otis came from a well-off colonial family. He studied at Harvard, trained in law, and rose quickly through the ranks of Boston's legal elite. But it wasn't power or profit that guided him. It was principle, and that principle burned. In 1761, he stood before the Superior Court of Judicature and delivered a fiery 5-hour oration against the British writs of assistance, documents that allowed customs officials to search homes and ships at will. To Otis, they were nothing short of tyranny. And in that courtroom, he uttered the words that would rattle the empire. Taxation without representation is tyranny, a phrase that would haunt redcoats and inspire rebels for generations. John Adams, then a young man in the gallery, would later say, "Then and there, the child of independence was born." But his brilliance had a price. That fire that burned so brightly within Otis eventually consumed him. He became erratic, unstable. His mind, once a weapon, began to fracture. Some say it was the result of brutal beatings by British loyalists. Others whispered of inherited madness. Whatever the cause, the final chapters in his life played out in isolation and sorrow. And yet, even in death, Otis would not go quietly. He had once declared he wished to die when God shall please, struck by lightning. On May 23rd, 1783, as if summoned by fate itself, Otis's wish was fulfilled when a bolt of lightning struck his house where he stood, killing him instantly. Now a permanent resident of Granary Burial Ground, James Otis Jr. was a mind unraveled by storm, but a legacy seared into the bones of a nation. He was the thunder that rolled before the tempest we now call the American Revolution, and his words, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," still echo through the chambers of American memory. A firebrand turned phantom, his voice lingering long after the lightning that struck him. In the pantheon of American revolutionaries, some names blaze in your memory, while others smolder quietly in the shadows. Robert Trepaine was one such ember, a steady burning light in a world about to ignite. Similar to Otis Jr., Paine was his quieter shadow in the American Revolution, but just as bold with his ideals. Robert Trepaine was born in Boston in 1731, a child of faith and commerce, the son of a minister and merchant. He was a scholar of theology, a teacher of logic, and eventually a lawyer. In 1768, with the storm clouds gathering, Paine stepped onto the political stage as a delegate to the provincial convention in Boston. Just 2 years later, his role would darken. Alongside Solicitor General Samuel Quincy, Paine served as prosecutor in one of the most haunting early episodes of colonial unrest, the Boston Massacre Trials. He stood across the courtroom from John Adams, defending justice for the fallen, Crispus Attucks among them. Yet Adams' defense prevailed, and most of the British soldiers walked free. Paine didn't grandstand, though. He endured and he continued. In 1773 to 1774, he served on the Massachusetts General Court, then the Provincial Congress. In 1774, he journeyed to Philadelphia as a representative to the Continental Congress, a quiet architect of rebellion. Here he helped pen the final plea to the crown, the Olive Branch Petition, and secured precious gunpowder for the war that seemed inevitable. In 1776, his name was inked alongside the others, one of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, a vow made in daylight with a gallows looming in the dark behind them. Returning to Massachusetts, Paine didn't seek rest, though. He became Speaker of the House in 1770, joined the Executive Council in 1779, and helped draft the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, a document that still beats at the heart of the Commonwealth today. That same year, he became a founding member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, proof that even revolutionaries understood the power of thought and beauty. As Attorney General from 1777 to 1790, Paine prosecuted the treason trials of Shays Rebellion, a new storm rising from the ashes of old. From there, he ascended to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, serving as a justice until his retirement in 1804. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the most famous, but Robert Tree Paine was a steady flame that kept liberty alive when the world threatened it to go dark. A patriot whose steadiness held the fragile pieces of a revolution together while others shouted and shattered. And now beneath the weathered stones of Granary, he rests silent but never forgotten. A man of law, a man of letters, a man who signed his name to destiny. A long time ago, in the dead of night, under a moon veiled in clouds, a lone rider galloped through the quiet towns of Massachusetts. Sparks splashed as the shoes struck the cobbles of the road, his heart matching the stride of his steed. It's a tale every American child is told, more bedtime legend than sober history. But for Paul Revere, that ride was no fairy tale. It was the moment his name was etched into the bones of a nation. Born in 1735 in Boston's North End, Revere was the son of a French Huguenot Emery and trained as a silversmith, an artisan of gleaming metal and delicate precision. By trade, he helped shape silver. By fate, he helped shape a revolution. Long before his legendary ride, Revere was already steeped in the shadows of resistance. He engraved propaganda, carried secret messages for the Sons of Liberty, and watched as British troops poured into the city, blood staining the snow at the Boston Massacre, rage echoing through the narrow streets. In those uneasy nights, the plan for the Old North Church's lantern signals took form, a quiet system of fire and mourning, waiting in the darkness for its hour to strike. That hour came on April 18th, 1775. Warned that the British troops were marching toward Lexington and Concord, Revere borrowed a horse and vanished into the dark. The signal, one if by land, two if by sea, had already glimmered from the steeple of the Old North Church, carrying its silent warning in Boston. Though popular legend, thanks largely to Longfellow's poem, cast Revere as a solitary hero, he wasn't alone. William Dawes and Samuel Prescott also rode that night, and in truth, Revere never completed the full journey. Captured near Lincoln, Massachusetts, he watched as it was Prescott who pressed on. With the warning the regulars are out. Some may recall the name Sybil Luddington, the young rider often called the female Paul Revere. But her tale comes 2 years later in 1777, and many historians now believe her accounts may be more legend than fact. Still, it was Revere's name that history remembered, perhaps because it was already familiar. Just 2 years earlier, he had been one of the 3 men chosen to plan Boston's response to the British Tea Act. That plan became the British Tea Party, a nighttime spectacle in which Revere, disguised as a Mohawk, joined dozens of others in dumping imperial tea into the Boston harbor. He became the chief courier for the Boston Committee of Safety and the trusted messenger of Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly. His stocky figure and galloping horse became so familiar on New England roads that his name began appearing in London newspapers, whispered in fear by those who knew rebellion was stirring. Revere's rides weren't just symbolic, they were strategic. In 1774, he rode to New York and Philadelphia, carrying the fiery Suffolk resolves to the First Continental Congress. He later warned the Patriots in New Hampshire of British plans to seize ammunitions from Fort William and Mary, triggering a raid that yielded the very gunpowder used at Bunker Hill. He didn't fade after his most famous midnight ride either. He continued to serve, building a powder mill for the war effort, casting bells and cannons for the colonies, even commanding Castle William in Boston Harbor as a lieutenant colonel. When the Revolution ended, Revere returned to his trades. He ran a foundry, opened a hardware shop, and built an ironworks that would later become the Revere Copper Company. He turned molten metal into the material of a rising nation. Paul Revere died in 1818 and was laid to rest in Granary Burying Ground, beneath a modest marker worn by time, a simple stone for a man who carried fire in his veins and history in his saddlebag. But legends don't sleep, and somewhere still, the echo of hooves haunt the cobbled streets of Boston. A lantern flickers in the church tower, and a rider vanishes into the dark, setting out once again for a midnight ride. Most recently in Boston's 250th anniversary reenactment, a beloved celebration that carried history into the present, for once again, Paul Revere rode. Among the quiet stones of Granary Burying Ground, one name rests beneath weathered granite yet still stirs with unrest. Samuel Adams. He wasn't a general, nor a wealthy merchant, nor a man of careful diplomacy. He was something far more dangerous in the age of empire, a man of conviction who refused silence. Today, many recognize his name from a lager poured in Boston taverns, yet the name whispered time and again through history belonged to someone far greater. Born in 1722 in Boston, Adams was raised in the shadow of Puritan values and royal decree. He studied at Harvard, where even in his youth he questioned the sanctity of power. His graduation thesis argued that citizens had a right to resist the government when it betrayed the people. That idea would echo through every chapter of his life. While the modern beer brand is what keeps his name on people's lips, the historical Samuel Adams wasn't a brewer. He inherited his father's malt house, but proved to be a terrible businessman, quickly running the enterprise into the ground. His true craft wasn't commerce, but persuasion. Through pamphlets, petitions, and town meetings, he gave voice to colonial frustration and gave structure to unrest. When the Stamp Act was passed, it was Adams who helped organize resistance. When the British soldiers arrived in Boston, it was Adams who warned what their presence would bring. He was instrumental in the founding of the Sons of Liberty, and his deft use of words shaped how events like the Boston Massacre were remembered. In 1773, when British tea sat in the Boston harbor awaiting acceptance or defiance, it was Adams who helped rally the decision that became the Boston Tea Party. He served in the Continental Congress, signed the Declaration of Independence, and helped forge the Massachusetts Constitution. Though he was eventually elected governor, Adams craved no monuments to his name. For him, principle always overshadowed personal fame, and he seemed content to be a ghost in his own monumental story. But his time in power would reveal the deep ironies of a revolutionary's life. When Massachusetts farmers rose up in Shays Rebellion, protesting crushing debt, Adams, the former mob rouser, condemned them without mercy. He was deeply suspicious of the new U.S. Constitution as well, fearing it created a central power too much like the one he'd fought to destroy. For Adams, the fire of revolution was easy to ignite but far harder to control once the nation was his to govern. He died in 1803 at the age of 81 and was buried not far from the men he once stood beside, John Hancock, Paul Revere, and James Otis Jr. His tomb is simple, but his impact on history was anything but. Samuel Adams remains one of the most influential voices of the American Revolution, one who helped shape ideals, rallied ordinary citizens, and helped steer a colony toward independence. He was above all a citizen who understood that words, when chosen carefully, can change the course of a nation. You know him by his signature, sweeping and unshaken, less a name than a declaration. It was written not just in ink, but defiance, so bold that your John Hancock became another way of saying your name. Yet the man behind the famous script was more than just a signature. He was a pillar of the rebellion. Born in 1737 in Braintree, Massachusetts, Hancock's life was a tale of two fortunes. He began in modest circumstances, but after his father's death, he was adopted by his wealthy merchant uncle. Swept into a world of privilege, he studied at Harvard and eventually inherited one of the largest fortunes in the colonies, making him one of the richest men in New England. But wealth didn't soften him. As the Crown tightened its grip on colonial trade, Hancock used his fleet to push back. British authorities accused him of smuggling, and when his slap Liberty was seized in 1768, the streets of Boston erupted in riots. In that moment, Hancock the merchant became Hancock the revolutionary. He found a powerful ally in Samuel Adams, and together they became the engine of the rebellion in Massachusetts. Hancock's vast fortune funded the resistance, arming militias, printing pamphlets, and sustaining the cause when others wavered. By 1775, his name was at the top of the Crown's list of wanted men. The British march to Lexington wasn't just about seizing arms, it was an order to arrest Hancock and Adams, forcing them into flight on the very morning the revolution ignited. Then came 1776. As president of the Second Continental Congress, it was Hancock who signed the Declaration of Independence first. He made his signature so large, he famously declared that King George could read it without his spectacles. This was more than bravado. That signature wasn't just bold, it was a target on his back, and John Hancock knew it. After the war, Hancock was elected the first governor of Massachusetts, a role he would hold for most of his remaining years. Though his health faltered, his public stature never did. He remained a living symbol of the Revolution's hard-won dignity and its unwavering defiance. He died in office in 1793 and was buried with the highest honors in Boston's Granary Burying Ground. His tomb stands there today, a prominent stone sentinel watching over the fellow patriots resting beside him, a fitting public monument for a man who never shied away from the spotlight. John Hancock was more than a signature. He was wealth in the service of principle, vanity in the service of a cause, and elegance in the face of an empire. He wrote his name across a moment in history and made sure no one would ever miss it. His name is etched in stone on one of Boston's most iconic landmarks, but Peter Faneuil's legacy is haunted by a darker truth. Born in 1700, he was a merchant of immense fortune whose ships crossed the Atlantic and whose riches were deeply entangled in the economy of human bondage. While he was a benefactor to the city, his wealth was built on the profits of a slave trade. In fact, Boston's cobblestones don't forget easily, nor does the grim. In 1742, Faneuil made a grand gesture of civic pride, offering to build and donate a public marketplace to the city. That building would become Faneuil Hall. Here lies the profound and unsettling irony. The hall, bankrolled by a slave trader, would soon be dubbed the Cradle of Liberty, the very place where patriots would stand to demand freedom. Peter Faneuil would never hear those fiery speeches. He died in 1743, just 1 year after his hall was completed, forever unaware of the building's revolutionary destiny. He was laid to rest nearby in Granary Burying Ground. Beneath the tall granite obelisk at the heart of Granary lie two names history nearly forgot: Josiah and Abihai Franklin, the parents of one of America's most extraordinary minds. Josiah was a candlemaker from England, and Abihai a Nantucket native. They raised 17 children in a cramped Boston home. One of them, their son Benjamin, would go on to shape a nation with wit, invention, and diplomacy. They were not rich nor famous, but their home was a place where curiosity was fed and ambition was kindled. They worked hard, prayed often, and educated their son as best they could. In his writings, Benjamin Franklin remembered them with a lifetime of fondness and reverence. The obelisk marking their grave was erected long after their deaths. It was a tribute from a grateful city, honoring not just a great man, but the quiet, humble lineage where his story truly began. The shadow of the Salem witch trials is long, and it falls even here in Granary Burying Ground. It touches the grave of Samuel Sewall, a prominent Puritan judge forever haunted by his role in the tragedy. He was one of 9 magistrates who condemned 19 people to hang based on spectral evidence and whispered accusations, staining the soil of Massachusetts with innocent blood. But unlike the other judges who carried their guilt to the grave in silence, Sewall did something unheard of. He publicly repented. Born in England in 1652 into a life of piety and privilege, Sewall's family crossed the Atlantic twice before finally settling in Newbury, Massachusetts in 1661. Samuel was raised in the strict light of Puritanism, studying at Harvard and composing verse with a fever that never left him. He was a scholar, a poet, a keeper of journals, and one day a judge. In 1674, he began writing a diary that he would keep for more than 50 years. A journal that would expose not only the life of a colony, but the unraveling of a man's conscience. He married Hannah Hall in 1676, the daughter of Boston's wealthy mint master. As legend tells it, her dowry was her weight in silver. They would have 14 children, though few would survive to adulthood. Sewall's life was one of constant births and burials, prosperity and plague. Like the city itself, he was always balancing righteousness and ruin. By 1692, he had risen through the colonial courts and was appointed to the Court of Oil and Turmor, the special tribunal summoned to try those accused of witchcraft in Salem. Here, under dim candlelight and the cries of the afflicted, Samuel Sewall sentenced the innocent to death. He watched Giles Corey pressed beneath stones. He signed his name to the hangings of 19 souls. While others moved on from the madness, Sewall could not. In the years that followed, personal tragedies struck his home again and again. He believed it was the judgment of God. Finally, on a cold January morning in 1697, Samuel Sewall stood in silence before his congregation as his formal confession was read out loud. While the other 8 judges involved in the trials would carry their actions to their grave, Sewall publicly repented for his sin in condemning the innocent. It was an unprecedented act of humility. Of the 9 magistrates who presided over the cursed court, he was the only one to ever admit doing wrong publicly, earning him the nickname that would follow him the rest of his life, the repenting judge. For Samuel Sewall, however, repentance was not a single act, but a lifelong process. His conscience, awakened by the ghosts of 1692, soon turned him to another great injustice of his time: slavery. In 1700, he published The Selling of Joseph, the first anti-slavery tract printed in North America, arguing that liberty was next in value to life. He used his pen to challenge an institution that society accepted. The document was largely ignored, but it remains a quiet testament to his evolving conscience. He lost his wife Hannah in 1717 and would marry twice more. In 1730, at the age of 77, Samuel Sewall died in Boston. His body now lies in Granary Burying Ground. But unlike most of the dead, his ghost doesn't beg for innocence, and only asks to be remembered. 5 years before the shots at Lexington and Concord, the first blood of the American Revolution was shed on the streets of Boston. Here in a common grave lie the 5 men killed in that conflict, known to history as the Boston Massacre. Alongside the famed Crispus Attucks are 4 other names murdered on March the 5th, 1770, who are remembered here: Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr. Their shared tomb is a stark reminder that the first price for American independence wasn't paid by soldiers on a battlefield, but by civilians on a city street, making them the first martyrs of a war that had not yet officially begun. Granary Burying Ground doesn't boast of its hauntings. It doesn't cry out in the night like a crumbling asylum or beg for attention like a shuttered hotel. No, it waits. It watches. And if you linger long enough beneath the swaying arms of its elms, it may even remember your name. Visitors speak of strange lights, orbs that drift beneath the stones, hovering like fireflies out of season. Some claim they pulse like they're breathing. Skeptics call it dust or tricks of the camera. But to those who've stood alone within the gates after dark say they feel less like light and more like watchful souls, briefly visible through a thinning veil. They're shadows, too, that move against the stillness, vanishing when confronted. The most frequently spotted specter is said to be of James Otis Jr., tall and solemn, still pacing his grave at dusk and dawn. They say his mind is still loud with revolution, his body still humming with the storm that struck him down. A patriot in life and perhaps a penitent in death. Paranormal investigators have brought their tools to listen, and the cemetery has replied. Whispers caught on tape, machines short circuiting near Otis's grave, electromagnetic readings that spike and fall without pattern. The static sings, and something answers from beneath the stone. They say it's the nature of cemeteries to be still, but Granary is never truly silent. Beneath its worn markers lie over 5,000 souls, though barely half that number have a name above ground. The rest are stacked in layers like pages in a book that no one is allowed to read. It's not just a cemetery, it's a city beneath a city, humming with the energy of so many unfinished stories. You're like the architects of rebellion and the judge who repented for Salem. Their presence lingers not just in stone but in the atmosphere, in the way that the wind hesitates as it turns a corner, or in the way that your own step seems to echo a little too loudly. Granary doesn't claw at the living or wail through the trees. It doesn't haunt with spectacle. It broods. And when the last tourist has passed through its gate, when the city exhales into sleep and the ground stirs once more, not loudly but deeply, a shifting of its shadows, a breath held in stone, a name whispered not aloud but inward. As the wrought iron gates of Granary Burying Ground groan shut behind us, the stories slip back into stone, and the dead return to their uneasy rest. But they're never quiet for long. Thank you for joining us as we crossed over the veil into Granary Burying Ground, descending into the hauntings of history. The gate is sealed, the veil drawn, but death keeps no calendar on the grim.